Lots of people are buying SLRs these days, and we all want to make the most of our expensive new cameras. Unfortunately, just getting started can be a daunting task. When you cut through all the terminology, though, photography is just as simple as it was 50 years ago, maybe even simpler. Once you understand the basic elements of exposure and how they relate to each other, the rest of the details just fall into place. And there are only three things that you need to learn to understand exposure. They are 1. Aperture, 2. Shutter speed, 3. ISO, and 4. Nothing. It's just those three things. Let me start with aperture. The aperture is the circular opening in your lens that you can make smaller or larger to allow in more or less light. The opening is formed by several blades that slide over each other, so the opening isn't perfectly circular, but it's pretty close. In side view here, you can see the aperture is like a door that opens and closes inside the lens. Anyway, the aperture settings for the lens are called f-stops. Here at the bottom of the screen, you see a typical scale of f-stops for a professional lens. The smallest numbers, like f2.8 on the left, are the largest openings in the lens. Each time you change the setting to the next larger number, the opening in the lens gets smaller and lets in exactly half as much light. So if you start off at f2.8, it lets in a lot of light. If you switch to f4, it lets in half as much light. And if you switch to f5.6, it lets in half as much light as f4, which is a quarter of what we got at f2.8. That is important, so pause and replay if you need to. So that was the exposure part, but aperture also controls something else that affects how your photos look, and that's the depth of field. Depth of field is basically how blurry your background and foreground are compared to what you're focusing on. If you use a large opening in your lens, the background will be very blurry. That's called a shallow depth of field. If you use a small opening, which remember is a larger f-stop number, the background will be less blurry. So for example, this photo was taken with the aperture set at f2.8, so it has a shallow depth of field. The background is pretty blurry. This one was focused in the exact same place and the camera was in the same position, but it was taken with the aperture set at f32, and you can see how much difference there is in the background and foreground. Shutter speed is even easier to understand. I think that even most beginning photographers know that the shutter controls how long the sensor is exposed to light. The less time the shutter is open, the less light gets through. You set it for 1 second, and light reaches the sensor for a full second. The next setting up is a half second, and half as much light gets to the sensor. The next setting is a quarter of a second, and again, half as much light gets to the sensor as the previous setting. And so on. With each setting change, it gets cut in half, and then in half, and in half, and so forth. And of course, if you're changing the setting in the opposite direction, you're getting twice as much light. If you've been paying attention, you're probably starting to see a pattern here. And of course, the shutter speed can make a difference in how your photos look. Using a fast shutter speed will freeze the motion in your picture, but if you use a slow shutter speed, you'll get blurry motion. ISO is a little different from aperture and shutter speed. Instead of controlling how much light gets to the sensor, it controls how much light the sensor needs to make the image. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. Suppose for a moment that light enters your camera in neat little cubes. And let's say these are the cubes it takes to get a correct exposure at ISO 200. It's 48 cubes. If you set the camera to ISO 400 instead, the sensor only needs half as much light, 24 cubes. Set it to 800, and again, it's twice as sensitive, and you only need 12 cubes. 1600 needs half as much light again, and 3200 needs half as much light as that, and so forth. So when you set the camera to high ISO, you can take pictures when there's a lot less light. Pretty simple. So why wouldn't we just shoot at high ISO all the time? Because the higher you set the ISO, the more digital noise or film grain will be visible. For example, here's an image shot at ISO 100. There's no noise to speak of. Here's the same photo shot at ISO 6400. And unless this video quality is really bad, the difference should be pretty obvious. So, how do these things, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, work together? Check out this diagram. Here we've got the camera set to f2.8, ISO 400, and for simplicity's sake, the shutter speed is 1 second. And if we take a picture with the camera set up like this, the exposure is just right. Now, what if we want more depth of field? We set the aperture so that it's 1 notch smaller. But what happens when we take the picture? Well, now only half as much light is getting to the sensor, so the picture is underexposed. How do we fix it? Easy. We can make the shutter stay open for twice as long, 2 seconds. And if we cut the amount of light in half with the aperture again, by setting it down to f5.6, we can make up for it by doubling the shutter speed again, to 4 seconds. But let's back up again for a moment, to where we started. 1 second, f2.8, ISO 400. If we set the aperture down to f4, there's another option. We can leave the shutter speed at 1 second, but change the ISO to 800. Now the sensor only needs half as much light, which is perfect because only half as much light is getting through the lens. And if we stop down the aperture another notch to f5.6, we can make up for it by changing the ISO to 1600. At this point, the picture should be pretty clear about how these 3 factors relate to each other. If you change any one of the settings in one direction, you have to make up for it by moving either one of the other 2 in the opposite direction. So if we set the ISO up 1 notch to 1600, we can make up for it by setting the shutter speed down 1 notch to a 2/50th of a second. If we move the ISO down from there 2 notches to 400, we can make up for it by opening up the aperture 2 notches to f4. And you can split the change between 2 of the other settings. If we set the shutter speed up 2 notches to a 60th of a second, we can compensate by setting the ISO down 1 notch to 200 and the aperture down 1 notch to 5.6. Just one final note. Even though I've been saying stuff like change the setting 1 notch to ISO 400 or a 2/50th of a second, these notches actually have a name. When the change you make doubles or cuts in half the amount of light getting to the sensor, or the sensitivity of the sensor, it's called an FStop, but that usually gets shortened to just plain stop. So next time you hear someone talk about adding a stop of exposure, you'll know what's up. And that's it. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel on YouTube or on Vimeo, and leave feedback if you feel like it. I'll try to answer questions if I can. For more information about all this stuff, visit us at lightandmatter.org.